If you could tell me a little bit about your introduction to Shakespeare and what your initial impressions were of his work when you were first encountering it.
Absolutely. I'll try and be brief. So,
You don't
like
have to
most,
either.
um, so like most, public school kids, I was introduced to Shakespeare in junior high, what they now call middle school, and I remember very distinctly we were assigned to read Romeo and Juliet, and I was particularly miserable because I just couldn't understand it. Trying to read the play and it felt like a foreign language. It felt sort of stuffy. I didn't get it. So I remember my mom took me to the Blockbuster video. That was a thing back then. And they didn't have, we were looking for the Zeffirelli and they didn't have the Zeffirelli, but there was West Side Story. So I remember we rented West Side Story as my introduction to Romeo and Juliet. And then eventually I did see the Zeffirelli one, which I still really love a lot to this day. Um, but then I went to high school where there's even more required reading. So in several English classes, there it is again. And at that point in my life, I was really resistant to it. I didn't. I felt like it. I really was like, why is a play that's whatever 400 years old, written by like a dead white guy? What does that have anything to do with me or my life? And we were shown what at the time I would categorize as bad movie versions. Obviously, I'm more evolved in my thinking now, and so they're just movie versions that represent the time that they were made. But I really hated it. I mean, I really hated Shakespeare, and I really felt like it was a weapon that was being used against me as a student to say that I wasn't smart enough or good enough, or it was it was boring. It didn't feel pertinent to my life, and I was a drama kid, but we didn't do it in the drama department. It was something my drama teacher she didn't have a lot of interest in herself, so I wasn't introduced to it as theater. It was just in my English classes. So great, fine. I go off to college. I want to be on Broadway. I'm going to be a star. I'm a theater major. And I decided to do this summer program at American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, their summer training congress. And it's like modeled after MFA conservatory training. And so we have specifically like text class that's specifically for Shakespeare. And then we have our scene study classes. And I remember in my scene study class being assigned something that that was really upsetting for me. And it wasn't Shakespeare, it was a contemporary play, but I was playing a character who, was on drugs and had lost her son to foster care. And I was like, is this really, as a Black woman, the only thing I have to look forward to as an actor? Is like these kind of characters. And the acting teacher who was Chicano, his name is Tommy Gomez. He recently just passed. So I love to speak his name whenever I can. He was a classical actor and he said, well, what about, Shakespeare? And I was like, oh, that stuff's so boring. I don't understand it. And he's like, more actors of color get employment in Shakespeare and musical comedy than anything else. This was in the late 90s. He said, so, it wouldn't hurt you to just like have it as part of your toolkit. He said, we'll do some Shakespeare scene studies. And so I started that summer reading the plays, but with a mindset towards acting. And Tommy cast me to play Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream. And I had the time of my life. It was the most fun I had ever had as an actor. It was the hardest I had ever had to work as an actor. I had to really decode the text. I had to look things up. I had to figure out how to say the words and convey the meaning and make it clear to the listeners, which meant I had to really understand it first. And um, there was like a full body engagement that had to happen. It was so muscular to have to do that language and be so physical in my body that I loved it. And from that time on, I've started being like a little bit hooked. so I said, okay, I'm going to give these plays a chance. And I started by reading the comedies because they were a little bit easier. By then, there were more accessible versions of the films, like the Baz Luhrmann, Romeo and Juliet. Kenneth Branagh has started making a lot of Shakespeare films, right? So the Fellow with him and Lawrence Fishburne was out, and that Hamlet he did with Kate Winslet. So I just sort of started taking it in, and then auditioning for more Shakespeare plays. So I did a lot of acting in Shakespeare plays, and then in my early 20s, I sort of made a shift to directing, and I still had a huge appetite for those plays. And so I've really been on a trajectory of dedicating my time and energy to decoding these plays and removing barriers to access for these plays, all because I started as a kid who was like, this sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a question I was planning to ask later, but now seems like the perfect time. So I was reading your old blog that you wrote about Shakespeare criticism, and you talked about falling in love with Shakespeare's language because it's so like epic and messy and emotional, and you just said it's like muscular to perform. But also you talk about, this language presents real challenges, whether that's just because it's old and confusing and feels like a different language, or also um, in my class we read this James Baldwin essay, Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, and he talked about Shakespeare being like this agent of oppression and white cultural supremacy, and he didn't resonate with it. He felt like it was being used to oppress him. So I wanted to ask how you approach the task of like doing Shakespeare, putting on a Shakespeare play for people who feel for whatever reason that this language just isn't theirs.
Yeah, it's sort of this interesting conundrum because we think of this, as foreign, or sometimes I hear people call it old English. It's not old English. It's actually early modern English. But yes, a lot of the syntax and usage was different than how we speak now. And even beyond that, punctuation wasn't regularized, spelling wasn't regularized. Shakespeare invented so many words. And what actually um, helped me kind of lean into that is being somebody who was like an urban youth, somebody who was into hip hop, and actually linking those ideas that, like, oh, Shakespeare was using some colloquial phrases, and Shakespeare was using slang, and Shakespeare was talking a lot in metaphor, simile, like the same way we might, like cap cap on one another, on the block, or the way to get a rhyme scheme right for a poem or a battle rap or whatever. You might flip your syntax to get that rhyme scheme right. And like, no, that's not like the formal writing that we would turn in on an essay, but it conveys meaning and it has its own thing. So once I started realizing that what Shakespeare is doing is actually much more closer to what it is like to be a hip hop head or be like an urban youth, and it made more sense to me. And and the idea that, like, as a young kid, you say ain't and you get like in trouble for saying ain't, or if you say, I asked you and you get in trouble for saying it like that, or, I'm finna, and like these things you're told these things. And it's not the king's English or the queen's English, but and Shakespeare is sort of held up as this epitome of like the queen's English, the king's English, and as he went. And so I think, to answer your question more directly, when we do these plays now, I want for the actors to make sense of it, in their own sort of body and their own rhythms. And like, yes, we have um, iambic pentameter there for the verse, but how do we convey meaning now? How do you need to shape a sentence to convey meaning now? What is the thought? So we have all these tools with the meter and the verse and, trochee and like we have all of that, but we also just have, I'm trying to communicate a thought. I'm trying to communicate an idea. How do I shape my sounds to do that? And I think that also changes over time. So I encourage actors to, like, if they want to do an intonation or an inflection or something that feels very contemporary, um, but it's communicating the meaning, even if the meaning is a little bit shifted from what we might speculate Shakespeare wrote, that's fine with me. Because it's like, what is our audience going to get today? So I love for actors to like figure out in their bodies how the rhythm makes sense, figure out in their bodies how they want to use the punctuation. The punctuation for sure is not a specific science. And I know there are people who are like first folio purists, but the first folio was assembled posthumously. So Shakespeare did not authorize that. So I'm like, punctuation is a suggestion in Shakespeare's case. It's different with with contemporary plays where we've had regularized punctuation. The playwright wanted that comma for a reason, but with Shakespeare, it might be like, maybe if you tried it with that comma, or you know what, that comma is holding you up. What if you tried it without that comma? Or like, how do you play a colon or a semicolon, right? Like, that's so open to interpretation. So I just want actors to like live in it in a way that makes sense for them, um, and not worry about any affectation or any sort of like Shakespeare voice or anything like that. I'm not interested in
Yeah,
that.
I wanted to ask, so we talked a little bit about your experience as Shakespeare in school, and I'm kind of interested in hearing how your relationship to Shakespeare changed when you started pursuing directing and theater as a career, because it's an art form, but it's also a job, and that presents its own challenges. So how did that change your relationship to Shakespeare, making that transition?
Yeah. That's a like multi-layered answer. So sort of in one regard, when I sort of discovered Shakespeare and came to understand the plays not as like these like great literary achievements, but actually like blueprints for production, like things that were not actually written to be read, like we would read a novel, but actually written to be embodied by humans, and they were meant for performance. Um, that right there helps me a lot, just to know that like he like gave each actor their sides on the go. Like he didn't sit down to like write a tome. So that gave me permission already to just sort of free myself from this notion that this is some literary masterpiece, and that it's meant to be embodied. The words are meant to be embodied. It's meant to have a human expression, a heartbeat and breath. And so as an actor, I was really excited about that. Then when I shifted to directing, see, I started in theater as a musical theater person, so everything to me already had like that sort of large scale, and there already for me was an integration of like music, the voice, song, movement, and dance. And Shakespeare seemed to just lend itself to that so well, and it felt like big and messy and epic, and not like a kitchen sink realism, which was something that I kind of was like, "Oh, it's a little boring," but Shakespeare felt like it had that largesse, it had that epic. Some of these plays jump 15, 30 years, right? Like Pericles takes a span of like 15 years. Antony and Cleopatra is like 42 scenes. Um, so so for me, it also became a place where like um my creative imagination could sort of run wild. And and I think that Shakespeare can bear the weight of almost anything. I won't say everything. I've seen some productions, and I've attempted some concepts that maybe were ill-advised, but it can bear the weight of almost anything. I mean, it's had to, right, to still be with us, whatever, 450 years later. And so for me, that opened a lot of doors creatively in my imagination. Um, but when you talk about the career aspect, right? So like as an artist, it was like all this wonderful possibility, and it's like somebody giving you the keys to the kingdom. But career wise, it had been a real challenge because there are a lot of gatekeepers. There are a lot of people, um, academics and theater professionals alike, who believe themselves to be the authority on Shakespeare. They believe themselves to be, you know, the Shakespeare scholars. And traditionally, that has been a lot of white folk in this country. And even within that, a lot of that has been white men. And so when I'm, you know, whatever, fresh out of grad school, 30 something, you know, black woman, there's a lot of gatekeepers. And so career wise, I had to do a lot of maneuvering and strategizing and asking for opportunities. I remember in grad school, I said to my advisor, I really need you to let me do Shakespeare as my thesis, because if I don't do it here in the academy and have it on my resume, nobody will take me seriously out there. They won't think that I have the like requisite training or, you know, whatever to consider myself a Shakespearean. Fortunately, my grad school gave me that opportunity, and I'm so grateful because it is exactly what I needed. So it has been um, this sort of juggling game of like as an artist, it's been so fulfilling. It's been like the my favorite plays to play in have been these Shakespeare plays. Um, and yet career wise, it has often felt like an uphill climb and a little bit of a fight. Um, and I spent a lot of years really trying to brand myself as a Shakespeare director to like really get people to take me seriously as somebody who had the chops and knowledge to do Shakespeare. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's also interesting because, you know, I've read a lot and I've heard a lot about increasing like the number of people of color that are cast in roles in theater. Um, but I think people seem to talk a little bit less about the other roles. And so I'm interested as a director, what are your thoughts on how to make the theater world easier or more welcoming for people like you? Like, how do you remove those gatekeeping? I
Yeah.
mean, what
Yeah.
have you seen work? Are there any initiatives that have had like a tangible success? Yeah, what are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
Well, I will say, even just from when I finished grad school 10 years ago till now, I have seen a lot of shifts. I have, and I do think there are some initiatives that I'm a beneficiary of that I have seen work, like the Drama League in New York, which is the like oldest service organization specifically invested in the careers of stage directors. They have a classical directing fellowship specifically for directors of color. Um, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where I spent 6 years in residence, also has several uh, directing programs, and I was a directing fellow there. And while it's not specifically geared for people of color, like anybody can apply for those things. Um, the idea is that if you get that fellowship, you're specifically going to work on a large scale classical play, and OSF has a lot of equity initiatives, and so that apprenticeship program does a lot of work to make sure that they're recruiting a wide array of folks. And so again, I got that fellowship and was there working on a large scale Shakespeare play, and then I was in residence there for 6 years. And I also know some other programs that are doing things like the Old Globe in San Diego has a classical initiative for directors of color. So I'm seeing these things pop up more and more. It also, I think, was an academy issue for a while. So if you think of like the highest ranked conservatory programs that we might think of, like Yale School of Drama, well, you know, all MFA students in the acting and directing at Yale are going to spend their second year on a verse project, like it's part of the curriculum. Um, so when they start admitting more students of color, then that creates a stronger pipeline to professional opportunities, because then there are more directors of color coming out of that program who have the training. Now, part of it is I also think we have to leave space for theater makers of color to decide if they have any interest in Shakespeare at all. I don't think it should be compulsory. Like if theater makers don't want to do Shakespeare, nobody should force them to. Nobody should say you have to want to do this thing. But I do think we have a sort of long-standing tradition of like directors aren't hired unless a artistic director has seen their work. And so there's been this like cycle of, we hire the people that are already in our circles. And so at some point, somebody just has to say, I'm ready to take a chance on a director who might be young, on a director who might be BIPOC, on a director who might be trans. And I've not seen their work because they were working in wherever, right? They were working in San Francisco and I didn't get out to San Francisco, or they were working in Chicago and I didn't make it over to Chicago. But I talked to them. They seem eager. They seem excited. They have a good head on their shoulders. Let's take the chance. And I think theaters have been very shy about taking the chance. And in fact, I've heard panels where people say, well, it's an unknown quantity and hiring women and people of color is the risk. And I feel like that's antithetical to the idea that we are in the non-profit sector, right? Most regional theaters are not for profit. So you can hire a director. Like we have to stop operating on these corporate models and talking about like risk.
Honest, yeah.
Yeah. I think we can think about return on investment and what happens if you're the person that takes the chance on that young director, on that woman director, on that trans director, and that disabled director. And they actually are the genius we've all been waiting for. And then like there, you get to put that feather in your hat. So I do feel like I've seen that change. I have like I'm on a panel tomorrow night where we're all directors of color talking about Shakespeare. So I've certainly seen the change happen. I have like a lot of colleagues. I have a dear friend who has a theater group, Black Girls Love the Bard. So I'm a friend who started Shakespeare in Detroit. She's another Black woman. So we're out there, and I think, early in my career, I was like, well, if they knew that I was here, they'd give me more opportunities. So I thought it was about shouting loud enough. And then I realized, oh no, it's not about shouting loud enough. They don't care. And I've been on many panels and in many conversations, especially over this last 18 months, where I'm starting to see that Shakespeare theaters, classical theaters are recognizing that they must care. They must start to care if they haven't. I think many of them were on that path, on that trajectory already, but now they must start to care. And so I'm seeing a greater effort to get other folks, directors, designers in the door. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah. So you brought up the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and how they had kind of helped to encourage and give you a space to work. And I was reading an interview you did with Ayanna Thompson in the Shakespeare Race and Performance book. And you talked also about the OSF's policy of like color conscious casting, which is different than colorblind, because colorblind would be assuming like white neutrality. I'm interested in hearing you elaborate a little bit more on like what casting directors should be conscious of. Like, what are the potential pitfalls taking this approach, but also what are the opportunities? How have you seen color conscious casting make a production more interesting? How have you utilized that to make productions more interesting? But also what do you have to look out for when you do that?
Yeah. There are definite pitfalls if you're not thinking things through. I've certainly seen productions, Shakespeare and otherwise, where I'm watching and I'm like, yeah, that's great. There are plenty of people of color. Like, oh, great. They gave women these roles. Great. Okay. But then you're like, but it's just the villains, or it's just the shrews, or it's just the servants, or it's just, and so you start to be like, well, that's just reifying old bad tropes. So it's not enough to just be like, yeah, but we did this. and we cast people of color and we cast disabled actors. Like it's actually not enough to just tick things off the list. Like it needs to be thoughtful. And and people are all complex. So yes, I'm sure there are actors out there that are hungry to play villains. So I'm not saying never cast actors of color as villains, but where's the balance on any given production? And I am not suggesting that everything has to always just weigh equal, but but do consider that if you stack the show with all the villains are marginalized people of marginalized identity, and none of your romantic leads are people of marginalized identity, what are you saying? That people of marginalized identity don't fall in love, don't have partners that they think are sexy, even if they're plus size or 7 feet tall or use a wheelchair? Like, no, people live full lives and people love. And so it's like, yeah, great. That actor can play that villain, and that's great. And they want the opportunity to do that. And also let's give some of these actors opportunities to play romantic leads, to play the heroes. So that it's really fleshed out and really well-rounded opportunities, and not just um, reifying old, bad, trashy tropes. Also, for me, I know sometimes people get hung up on like the biology of it, that like, well, this race person and that race person can't make a this race child. But that negates the experience of so many multi-ethnic, multiracial humans. That negates the experience of people that might be adopted or not raised by their biological parents. Like, those are families too. My mom is white, so I've never looked like my mom. Never one day. But we're a family. So why can't you cast? I mean, especially with Shakespeare plays where it's the rarest that you have two parents in the story anyway, and there's always just like a dad or a mom.
The
Like,
moms are lost anyway.
yeah. So it actually, this idea that like, well, it has to make biological sense, but are you screening everybody's Irish identity when you when you do a Eugene O'Neill? Like, you're not actually asking those actors if they're Irish, right? So like, you might look at me and not, I think most people probably assume that I have a white parent, but I mean, I lean real heavy into being black. So you might look at me and not know that I have a white parent. But I do. And so multi-ethnic people should have the opportunity to live that life fully and on the stage. Um, so I think people get too hung up on that. But the converse of that is also, if you're just kind of doing it all arbitrary, then yeah, it might take some viewers out of the story. So there is still like, you do still have to be thinking conscious, give conscious thought to who you're bringing together as a company, how you're casting the play. Then you have to make sure that you're providing opportunities for those through lines to continue. um, I am a director who does not believe in asking actors to sublimate their identity. So I don't want an actor of color to come into the rehearsal room and say, well, wait, this person is playing my father and they're white and Shakespeare's white, so you must be asking me to play a white character. No, I'm asking you to play the ethnicity that you showed up with in the room today. I'm not asking you to pretend that you are not Black or Asian or multi-ethnic, that you are not a combination of many, many things. And so I think those mechanisms also have to be in place in the rehearsal hall, so that actors understand what they're being asked to do. Because I think sometimes actors of color are being asked to assume that white neutrality, but nobody's articulated that to them. And then they'll get notes about their speech or their dialect or a mannerism or something. So I think you also have to have that conversation so that it's clear. And for me, I'm like, I am not asking you to play a race other than the one you are. And if that means we need to have a conversation about, okay, well, then how is this Lord Montague and this is Lady Montague and I'm this? And so then we create that backstory, and maybe the audience will never know, but we built that with integrity in the rehearsal room so that that actor could be playing, the truth of it from where they come from, and not trying to imitate whiteness or some other ness. That so I mean, I could go on and on and on for casting, but I think yes, there are pitfalls. There are way more benefits, but it has to be handled thoughtfully and with care. And you actually have to have a conversation with the actors and let them know why you've invited them to be in the room with you and what expectations surround that. So they have clarity.
Yeah. Could you kind of talk about like your approach that you've taken in the past to racially conscious casting? Maybe like an example of a play you've done or something where you actually used racially conscious or color conscious casting to make the play more interesting?
Yeah. Sure. First of all, I don't direct monoracial casts that are all white. So that's something I stopped doing a long time ago. And with the exception of like one university opportunity that presented itself recently, I have not directed monoracial white casts. And I sort of just refuse to, and largely because my world is not monoracial. It is not monoracial white, it's not monoracial black, it's not even biracial. It's not I don't occupy a black and white world. Like I live in a very diverse area. My colleagues and friends make up a multitude of identities, race, gender, ability. So I always want to reflect the world that I hold space in on stage. So I always approach it from that mindset. Um, and then, I am trying to think through things in the story. And so there are situations, say I did Merry Wives at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where the like families were sort of wildly multi-ethnic without any disclaimer or writing it away, right? So there is a mom who's like Latina and a dad who's Asian, and then a daughter who's Latina, but then another kid who's black, and like how do we make sense of that? I didn't feel like we needed to write that in or explain that away because we were also doing this big raucous farce in Elizabethan silhouettes with 1980s hair and singing, so it's already like this is taking up the imagination space. I don't need to do that math for you as an audience. Like if you can't show up and just have a good time and just laugh, then you probably need to check some other things that you're wrestling with. Um, but if I use an example of this Lynn Nottage piece that I just did more recently, and we did it as an audio version, but still, it's written very specifically um, to feature a mixed race woman who's learning her history, that her father was brought here as an African. Well, the play is set in France, but brought to France sort of as an enslaved African, and her mother was the queen, and they had an affair, and la 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 la. Um, but in a otherwise you might think, okay, well, we cast the African black and we cast this young woman black or multi-ethnic or something, and then that's it. We cast everybody else as white. But I thought, well, that's such a missed opportunity. There were these other characters in the play that when I look at the text, like how this enslaved African relates to these other characters, there's like a kinship there. Like they talk about class and they talk about status. So I was like, so what if I also cast somebody black in that role too? Right. So I think you can also just stretch beyond and find those other little gems. I did a production of Romeo and Juliet at Chautauqua Theater, and they build sort of a company, and then those actors are shared between 3 shows. And so some of the other shows had more specific needs that were like specific towards race because they were doing like Detroit 67 and another show. And it was like, okay, so those shows set the tone because then all of those actors have to end up in this show. So we ended up with a cast that was predominantly actors of color. And what was, so beautiful about that is that we had a Romeo and a Juliet that were black, a Mercutio and a Benvolio that were black. But then we had a Friar Lawrence that was South Asian. And the Capulets were then a mixed, interracial couple. And And so the world was populated with a with a diverse array of people. And there was only that one place with the Montagues where it was like, okay, well they're both white. So how do they have a black son? But like I said, we talked about that in rehearsal, and the actor even came up with a backstory that felt satisfactory for him so that he could still show up and fully be a black man and not feel like he was playing like a white Romeo. And I think that has been such a great experience because it wasn't about we're gonna do an all black Romeo and Juliet or we're gonna do this spin on like we're gonna do Romeo and Juliet. And this is the company of actors that are gonna do Romeo and Juliet. And these actors represent many diasporas. And that was a lot of fun and a beautiful thing.
I want to be respectful of your time so we can kind of wrap up now, but I just wanted to ask you before you went, what is next for you? What are you working on right now? Where should people keep an eye out for you? What are you excited about?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm currently the associate artistic director of Aurora Theater Company, which is a theater um, in Berkeley, California, and I'm working with the playwright Cleavon Smith on developing his new play. And then I always have, gigs lined up. So um, I'm looking forward to producing some more things. The theater shutdown has me leaning a lot into technology. So I've done a lot of virtual um, theater, if we are going to call it that. And so I'm really kind of taken now by like this hybrid, what the future holds for theater makers and occupying a hybrid space. So I'm exploring some options.
Some things with technology.